Let's start with a verification. This device is pointing towards a DNS server that does not exist at this time. I will type IP config -all. And what I want to do is I want to highlight the fact that I am directing my traffic towards a domain name server located at 192.168.200.21. Now that device is my Infoblox machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log into it using the credentials of admin and Infoblox. And I want to say show network. We'll see here that this device does not have that IP address. So obviously, step one is going to be to provide the Infoblox server with the correct network information. We do that by typing set network and applying the correct configuration. So 192.168.200.21/24. 192.168.200.1 is the gateway of last resort. I do not want to configure IPv6. I do not want to become a grid member, and I verify my config. So this is the correct IP address, the correct mask, and the correct gateway. So let's go ahead and say that's correct. And we want to apply that to this device. Now this means that the Infoblox is going to go down and then come back up. Now that the Infoblox server has come back online, we need to log in again. Admin, Infoblox. And the next step, step 2, is going to be to enable our licenses. We're going to use temporary licenses by typing set temp_license. And of all of these licenses, the only ones that I'm going to be worried about are going to be DNS and DHCP. So those are going to be the only two that we're going to implement. If I had more than one of these devices, I could build a grid, which is going to be a cluster of devices providing services, but I'm not, so I'm just taking the path of least resistance. Do I want to do this? Yes. Restarting the user interface one more time. Are you sure? Yes. This is going to, again, cause the UI to restart, but you'll notice that we did not get kicked out of the config. Now what I want to do is I want to validate that this DNS server is reachable. So we'll say ping 192.168.200.21, and we have reachability to it. In fact, from this point, we need to begin looking at it from the user interface. I'm going to open a browser. I will direct that browser to https 192.168.200.21, and we will log in. The credentials, again, are admin, and the password is Infoblox. We'll hit login. Now, again, this is just a demonstration license or a temp license that we're going to be employing. I do not want to participate in customer experience improvement, and I do not have a support ID, so I'm just going to accept this. Step 3 is to navigate the Nios setup wizard. In this specific instance, I am not going to be configuring HA pair. I will be using a standalone appliance, and I will not be functioning as a grid. So I'll simply leave configure standalone appliance, hit next. I am going to change the name of the box from infoblox.local to infoblox.micronicslab.com. Hit next. Do I want to change the admin password? No, Infoblox works fine for labs. I do want to change my time zone. And I would like to enable the NTP service. And I am going to point this device to the NTP server located at time.google.com. Now, this is going to cause me a problem because we do not have any type of DNS services configured on the Infoblox server. So time.google.com will not be reachable, but we'll modify that as we move forward. I will hit next. I, again, do not want to participate in the improvement program. Validate the information. infoblox.micronicslab.com. The IP address is correct. The time zone is correct. We'll hit next one final time and hit finish. Accept this change, and this is going to cause our platform to restart again. So what's happening from the perspective of the device is going to be the fact that this UI that I'm interacting with will restart. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit refresh, and we can see here that the session has ended. Wait just a little bit, and then I'm going to go back to the system manager and log back in. What we want to do next is we want to take a look at the configuration. Specifically, I'm going to go to the System tab. Right now, I'm operating in standalone, and we can see that the device status is running, CPU, everything's green, but you'll notice here we have this NTP synchronization issue, and that's based on the fact that the device cannot get to the outside world. So step 4 is the fact that we need to change that. So I want to validate one thing. So I'm going to go back to the Infoblox server, and I'm going to say ping 8.8.8 because I want to know if I can get to that IP address, and I can. Subsequently, what I want to do is validate whether or not I can hit the DNS name. So I'm going to say ping www.google.com, any DNS name. And we can see here that I cannot. This is a direct result of the fact that I have not defined any type of DNS resolver for this Infoblox server. So to do that, I'm actually going to implement it from the perspective of the graphical user interface by clicking the little pencil here, which is going to be my edit option. And what we see is we have an option all the way down here that says DNS Resolver. I want to enable a DNS resolver, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to direct that to 8.8.8.8. And you can use your DNS service of choice here. And what we'll find is that now when I take a look at my config for my Infoblox server, let's see if I can hit google.com. Now, it's not working just yet, but remember, we're looking at using a graphical user interface to set up and do our configurations. So I want to give it a little bit of time to allow it to come up. So we'll repeat this a few times. And now we see that I do have the capability of pinging the URL. Now you'll note that the NTP service is still out of synchronization in the graphical user environment. Now we have a number of ways I can come in and I can refresh this. Now the problem that I have is that this device is trying to communicate to the outside world in order to be able to reach this NTP server, and NTP is not a very fast protocol. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the Infoblox server, and I'm going to execute a show NTP, and I want to see what's going on, and we can see here that so far it is only trying to look at local resources. It's given itself a Stratum 12 config. And, that's not really going to be sufficient to the task. Ultimately, we want this to go out to the outside world like what we had configured before. Now, I'm going to have a couple of options here. I could just reload this device and see if it comes up, or I could go ahead and do my configuration and then test it later. Because right now, what we're doing is we're looking for external synchronization, and we can see that the process has started, but it hasn't identified. Right now, it's in the initializing state. Once it's initialized and up and operational, it will say GOOG here for Google. Now, again, that's going to take a little bit of time, but this Infoblox server right now is not servicing NTP. It's not an NTP server at this time, and I want to modify that. So while we're waiting for this, all I'm going to do is go to the main screen. I'm going to go over to the toolbar, and you'll notice you have a section here called NTP. I'm going to hit the down arrow, and this is where I can configure my NTP system configuration. I can download any NTP keys that I want to use for authentication. Right now, I'm going to come in and say NTP, and what I want to do is I want to enable the system as an NTP server. I'm going to hit save. And then what I'm going to do once this has been applied is I'm going to go ahead and say restart services. Now, restart services on this Infoblox machine located at 200.21 if needed. And you can see its DNS is enabled, DHCP is enabled. I'm going to go ahead and hit restart, and let's see if we get any changes. Now, again, if we take a look at it from the perspective of the Infoblox server, let's see what the show NTP is doing. We can see now that we have communicated to Google. Everything's working. We are a Stratum 1 device, one hop away from the time source, but this still says that the NTP service is out of synchronization. Now, I'm going to go ahead and play with this moving forward because this will ultimately turn green, and it just happened to turn green as I was speaking. So right now, this device is connected to an NTP server, and it is also acting as an NTP server for my environment. And I'll be leveraging that for my DNAC, for my ACI, and for my SD-WAN infrastructure. So this part of the equation is done. Next, I want to address DNS. What we want to do is we want to make certain that we create an authoritative zone. So to do that inside of Infoblox, what I want to do is I'm going to go to my data management, and you'll note that we have IPAM functionality, DNS, and DHCP config. We'll start with DNS. Under the DNS configuration, I need to create a authoritative zone. That authoritative zone is going to be called micronixlab.com. micronixlab.com. I will hit next. And in this portion of the configuration wizard, I need to pick the server that I want to be authoritative for this zone. We only have one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click use this set of name servers. I'll hit the plus sign, and you'll see that the only option that I have is going to be infoblox.micronix.lab. So I'm going to add that. I'm not going to worry about any stealth configurations. This is not a Infoblox course. This is a SDX course. So once this has been added, I'm going to hit next, and then I'm going to say save and close. And we can see that this specific resource, infoblox.micronixlab.com, has been added to Micronix Lab. And before I activate this, I want to take a look at it, and we can see that we have a start of authoritative record. We have an A record for Infoblox itself that was all created by the system. But what I want to do is I want to create some hosts. Specifically, I want to make certain that my DNAC is defined. So we're using DNAC 2 in this lab. I'm going to say that it is assigned to the IP address of 100.64.0.102, and I'll hit save. I also want to configure my ICE engine, and in this lab I'm using ICE1, and it's located at the IP address of 100.64.0.120. Save and close. So these resources have been configured by me. They are part of the authoritative zone that I am working with. Now, the next thing I want to illustrate is that, again, I'm pointing towards this device. So if I type ping DNAC2.micronixlab.com, we see that I have no reachability. Now, I want to talk about the whys associated to this lack of reachability. I'm going to wait for this to resolve. Fail. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to type ns lookup. And this is going to be a way of using my desktop to query the DNS server. And what I want you to see right here immediately is that the DNS request has timed out. The IP address of the device that I'm trying to use is 192.168.200.21. And again, if I just type in something like DNAC2.micronixlab.com, it can't resolve it. And it's going to time out, sends multiple requests, waits 2 seconds, and then times out. You can see it sent 4 requests. Now, the reason it's failing is because DNS is not running on this Infoblox server. Now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to set everything up first so that I can then come in and say I want to start the DNS service. Now, this takes a little bit of time for everything to quote unquote come up and become operational. And again, just to illustrate from the system perspective, I want to point out the fact that DNS does not show up in this list. So these are, under the System tab, core functions that I can extend without any type of special licensing or configuration features or capabilities. When it comes to the functionality of the Infoblox server, data management is going to be where I'm going to be managing my DNS, my DHCP functionality, IPAM, file transport, anything that you want to be able to run inside of this resource. This device, Infoblox, as an IPAM server, is very handy for doing configurations and building our labs. It's also going to be something that's going to be a utility. I look at it almost like a Swiss Army knife. Now, let's see if this has done its thing. So what we're going to do now is I want to see, can I reach DNAC2.mychronixlab.com via a DNS query? And sure enough, we can see that it's resolved the name or the IP address of this DNS. So let's go ahead and try the other one, ice1.mychronixlab.com. It's working, but I still have a problem because remember, we're going to be building an SDA infrastructure, and the device, the controller in that SDA infrastructure, the DNAC, has to be able to communicate to the outside world. And just like my desktop, it's going to be pointing towards this DNS server. Now, if I were to type www.cisco.com, what we're going to find is it can't reach that URL. If I were to type www.google.com, it can't reach that URL. Now, the reason for this is based on the fact that I created an authoritative zone, and that authoritative zone is only authoritative for anything that's related to mychronixlab.com or whatever name we chose to use when we built the zone. So what's happening here is that this zone does not have the capability of being able to locate URLs that are outside of its authoritative control. We need to modify that, and we're going to modify that by setting up recursion and setting up a forwarder. So that's going to be, again, done from the perspective of the Infoblox user environment. I am going to go to default. Under default, I'm going to click the little pin. And when we take a look at what we have configured here, I'm going to go ahead and change to advanced mode, just to illustrate the fact that there are a lot more options than those that we just would normally see. But what we're looking at for this particular task is not considered advanced. Where we need to be, first of all, is under the General tab. You'll note here it says Enable Recursion. Recursion means subsequent lookups. And by default, this is off. Now, I'm not running a cluster. I'm not running anything. I'm just simply going to come over here and say override the behavior, and I want to enable recursion. So if a lookup fails in the authoritative zone of mychronixlabs.com or mychronixlab.com, what needs to happen is I need to tell the DNS server how to handle that. And the first thing is saying, okay, it's all right to look up this resource on another server. However, I want this server to be 8.8.8. That's going to be an external server. And in order to do that, I'm going to say, if you can't find it in mychronixlab.com, I want you to send it to the external server of 8.8.8.8 and hit save. Now, this is going to require me to restart my services because I've made configurational and operational changes. So let's go ahead and hit restart. And I'm going to go ahead and do it where necessary. Now, again, this is going to take a little bit of time. It's not something that just happens immediately. In fact, it could take a few minutes. But in such a small environment, what we want to do is go ahead and just see if we can't start this test. So just to validate that nothing's changed, can I still get to ICE1? Can I still get to DNAC? Yes. However, can I get to google.com? There's Google. Can I get to cisco.com? There's cisco.com. So what we just did is configured a fully functional DNS server that's going to give us all the capabilities that we need to move forward with our software-defined infrastructure labs, whether it's WAN, whether it's access, or whether it's ACI in data center. So what I want to do next is I want to enable DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Now, this is super simple. Just simply click the tag, go to Start, and turn the service on. It's going to activate the service for the interface LAN 1, and we need to restart services where necessary. And we can see in this instance, we're going to be requesting for both changes to DHCP and DNS because these resources will work together for us. So now what we've got is we have a fully configured server that is going to be able to offer us DHCP, DNS, network time protocol, and I want to leverage it as a IPAM server. Now, to do that, what I want to do now is I want to see if I can resolve reachability to my DNAC using its name, which is going to be a way of testing the DNS. So I will simply say DNAC2.micronicslab.com. So now it's going to have me log in, admin, ICE is cool. Right now, I want to call your attention to the fact that I'm using like the same version that's used in the Enterprise Infrastructure Lab of 1317. This is what we need to work with in the context of the Enterprise Infrastructure CCIE exam. So this is where I'm doing these demonstrations. The next part of this is going to be I want to add that Infoblox server to my DNAC. If we scroll down, you'll notice under the System 360, I have a IP address manager. Now, this is going to be a very useful tool for me as I lab, and I suggest you guys leverage one that you can download the software from Infoblox for free. It's virtual. You can run it inside of EvenG like I am, or you can run it inside of ESXi. But what I want to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and tell the DNAC about the existence of the IPAM server, the Infoblox server, how to log into it, and which of those particular views, remember, the view was default, that I want to leverage for this specific resource. So at this instance, I'm going to say Infoblox. I'm going to come down to the URL, and I'm going to say connect to infoblox.micronicslab.com. The username is admin. The password is Infoblox. Let's verify and make sure I didn't fat finger that. And the provider is the manufacturer or the vendor of the IPAM device. I could have used BlueCat. I could have used Infoblox. I could use a generic. I'm going to use Infoblox. And now when I hit the down arrow, I'm hoping that it will resolve the view of default, which it did. I will select it, and then I will merely apply this config. And we can see that the IPAM server was successfully created. So what I want to do next is I'm going to go back to my system settings window and scroll down to the bottom, and we should see that the IPAM server has successfully been added. Now, why would I be interested in having an IPAM server? Well, let's first of all take a look at the server. And what I want to point out here is notice that there's no data configured under IPAM and there's no data configured under DHCP. Now remember, this is our DHCP server and it is also our IP address management server. Now, if I go back to the DNAC and I go to design, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to network settings and I'm going to create a global level IP address pool. So like in class, what we'll do is we'll come over and we'll hit add. And I'm going to give this a name, and I'll go ahead and call it Pod 1 Global Pool. And I'm going to give it an IP address range of 100.101.0.0/16. And I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And that should create that pool for me to reserve addresses out of for my labs. Now, interestingly enough, if I go to the Infoblox server, and from the Infoblox server, I refresh, let's go to DHCP, notice there is that address, and if I go back to IPAM, there is that range of addresses. This is an extremely handy tool because now, by virtue of configuring it inside of the DNAC, the Infoblox server has learned it and will start providing these IP addresses to resources inside of my lab. When I go to my IPAM server and we take a look at the IPAM configuration here, we can see exactly what IPAM is. IP address management. It's going to tell me where I have conflict. It's going to tell me where I have leases that are active. It's going to give me defined exclusion ranges, reserved ranges, static mappings. Everything that I could possibly need in a lab environment is now at my fingertips simply because I took the option to install an IPAM server.